Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is now our 5th session of the PAVE Summit, where we are really looking to de-silo how we approach violence in the workplace and how we're dealing with it and how it's impacting our work, what we do inside and outside of work, the societies that we are moving in. And we have had some fascinating conversations and really meaningful conversations through our first 4 sessions. We expect that pace to keep going. I'm super excited about this panel. I just want to make sure that I point out some of these conversations that we're having may be activating. So please, there's a content reminder that please take care of yourself, exercise self-care throughout this conversation. So I just wanted to put that out there. I am Arlene Lemus. I've been chatting without sharing that. I am Arlene Lemus. I am the CEO of PAVE Prevention, which stands for Proactive Anti-Violence Education. Welcome to the summit. This is our 2nd summit. We've pivoted and moved virtual this year, and I think it's been fantastic, the type of access we've been able to have and the wide spectrum of participants we've been able to have. As I usually start these sessions, I try to share a few statistics, not because I don't think we are aware of these issues. I think everybody is well aware of these issues, but I think it's just a good starting point for me that we put this on everyone's, in the back of everyone's mind while we're having these discussions. So today I'm going to share with you that an estimated 246 million children experience school violence every year. And girls and gender non-conforming people are disproportionately impacted within that group. 246 million a year. Okay, and we're not even pulling in statistics on how teachers feel and what is happening to teachers in the educational sector, right? So 43% of teachers out of a 15,000 surveyed last year, 43% of them felt that violence, harassment, and abuse was taking a toll on them, and they were looking to change jobs. So just keep that in your mind as we are having these discussions. And our panel today brings in 3 uniquely different approaches to keeping our schools safe and having real conversations on changing culture within the schools. So I'd like to introduce our panel. Please, our panelists' bios will be in the chat. So please take a look at them. They're each doing incredible work in their circles. So I would like to share with you our panelists today. We have former law enforcement, former Secret Service, former FBI agent, current professor, a person with a lifetime of service to the community and keeping our community safe, Mr. Steve Hooper. We have Unitas Vice President. And if you don't know what Unitas is an organization that is disrupting human trafficking through training and survivor healing programs. Lamont Hebert, welcome. And then our last panelist, Youth Director for Communities United, really someone that I have watched grow up, becoming a community organizer, has grown up to an incredibly motivating adult through community organizing. Really, it's just incredible to see young people. We know when we see people like our panelist, Marie DeHelio, that we've got some hope. We're excited about the future. So our 3 panelists, Steve, Lamont, and Maria, welcome.
Good to be here.
Thank you, Arlen.
Great.
Excited to be here.
Great, great. So I'd like to give you guys just a few minutes to give us a little give our group some information on what you're doing and what's going on in your circle and how you are how you feel you have come to violence prevention. That's an easy one for Steve, but I'm going to start with Lamont. Lamont, if you could please share a little bit about what you're doing.
Sure. I've been in the counter human trafficking space for over 20 years. The first 10 years of that focused more on providing housing and therapeutic services for child survivors of trafficking in Southeast Asia. The last 10 years focus more on prevention in Eastern Europe and the US. As beautiful and wonderful and miraculous as survivors are in their as they progress in their healing journeys, as wonderful as that is, it's better to stop it before it happens or to catch it in the early stages. So my focus now is on expanding prevention education for youth and professional development for educators and staff in school districts and community organizations. Our biggest client right now is the New York City Department of Education, where we're tasked over the next 5 years to train all 75,000 staff at one level and social workers at another level. We have kind of a tiered training system, and then reach all 1.2 million children annually by year 5. So we just completed year 1, we're just entering year 2. And for context, we're already seeing just in year 1, 2 youth being identified per week as a victim or potential victim right under our noses, just in year 1.
Wow. Thank you, Lamont. Maria?
Yes. Hi. Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria DiHilio. I am with Communities United. I've been in organizing, just like Arlene kind of alluded to. I started when I was 15. This is my 17th year in organizing. My passion really is around education equity and creating that safe space for young people to be able to thrive and, you know, really compete and survive in this world. And so the project that we're embarking on right now is the Whole School Safety Initiative, which is a partnership, an unprecedented partnership between community-based organizations and the Chief of Safety and Security, or that department in Chicago Public Schools. And we have been strong for the last 3 years. It really came out of the summer of 2020 with the racial uprisings and the murder of George Floyd. And there was a resolution that came out to lead this process. And it's been 3 years since then. And so far, we have been able to move $10.9 million into holistic approaches to safety so far. And we have reduced the amount of school resource officers by 47% and moved into a more holistic approach that focuses more on restorative practice and really gives us support for schools. And that was with a pro-police mayor and a board that was appointed. So now in Chicago, we're making that transition. We have a very progressive mayor. So the trajectory of the project is actually looking really well. So, and the issue of police in schools hasn't really been touched in Chicago since the 70s. So 50 years later, we're making some really big strides. So.
Thank you, Maria. Steve?
Hi, everybody. Again, Steve Hooper, and my career is in mostly in federal law enforcement, but I was also a local police officer way back at the beginning in the mean streets of Dover, New Hampshire. So, so I had my wife and I started a company in retirement called Tripwire, and we've been meeting with the schools and training schools on a completely different approach, more of a prevention approach than a response. We get focused on lockdown drills. They're the new version of the old fire drill that a lot of us that are seasoned have dealt with when we were kids, and you did fire drills as a routine. Well, now they do lockdown drills, and those are necessary. I'm not saying we shouldn't have those, but I think there's a whole different approach. We had the benefit of half our career was before the attacks of 2001, and the other half post 2001. And the thing I always talk about is that the FBI back before 2001 was what I call a see man, lock man up mentality. And that's the crime happens, you show up, investigate it, prosecute them, and put them in jail, and then move on to the next crime. Post 9/11, post 2001, it became the old mantra, now the current mantra of never again. And the expectation became to not ever let that happen again. And we took on, the FBI took on a whole prevention approach. So in retirement, my wife and I decided we'd take that prevention approach, crisis management approach, a proactive approach to the schools, and train them on how to prevent it from happening. And that's what I'll mostly be discussing today, is how you put a plan in place to prevent it from happening. Not just respond if and when it does happen, but to prevent it from happening in the first place.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. So I'm going to kind of take, and please feel free after one of the panelists answers the question, if the other panelists want to chime in or piggyback onto something that's been shared or share a different approach to that, please feel free to chime in. So Maria, the task force that was created, I'll call it a task force. I don't know if it was officially called a task force, but the task force that was created to create Chicago's blueprint, right, for safer schools. It was a community-led process. So if you could share some information on that, it was youth-centered solutions. So if you could talk a little bit about that, and just really share some of the wins that the whole school comprehensive safety plan is already seeing, because I know that you guys are already showing big wins. So please share with us, Maria.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. I think, I think the issue of education has always been around. I know that that's how I started in the organization. I dropped out of high school myself, and when I dropped out of high school, it was really around like the lack of support that I had, and wanted a more rigorous, more relevant curriculum. And obviously I wasn't a 17-year-old asking for that. I was asking for it in different words, right? And so Voices of Youth in Chicago Education, which is a project of Communities United, or VOICE, we started back in 2007, and we've been working on school discipline and trying to end the school to prison pipeline, right, since our inception. And so we've been working on that for a long time. But when COVID happened, it was really a pivotal point where people were asking what it meant to be safe, health-wise, what it meant to be safe in their community after the murder of George Floyd, and a lot of the police brutality or accountability that was like really happening. So there was a lot of talk about safety, and that was the opportune time for young people to also ask, what does it mean for us to be safe in schools? And especially as young people of color, but also like just young people in general, what does it mean for us to be safe in schools? And so when the racial uprisings were happening, we saw a lot of school districts all across our nation really took an abolitionist point of view of like removing all of the police officers without a lot of conversation with community. It wasn't, it was more of kind of like what Stephen was talking about. It was a reaction, right? And the reaction was to pull all of the police officers out, which has been a long time like fight for a lot of like abolitionist organizations, or a lot of organizations in general. But when that happened, there wasn't like a lot of community involvement. It was a very top-down decision. And a lot of us, like what we're seeing now, a lot of them retracted that. And a lot of them either put all their police officers back, or they basically, they funded the school resource officer program, or a lot of them went into the private sector and actually got private policing, or like private security guards who are armed, which made it a lot more difficult for public accountability. And so while all that was happening, when all of the other school districts across the nation were pulling out their school resource officers, Chicago, we were trying to push for that as well, but we didn't have that political landscape, right? And so what ended up happening was having a resolution that called for a community-led process that was youth-centered. And so when we did the whole school safety process, it was a very difficult beginning, especially because the chief of safety and security is Jadine Chow. And when I was 17, my biggest task was to rally her almost every day. And so when she called me on December 23rd on 2000, like she was like, hey, we really need voice. We really need Communities United to make sure that, we have that community connection. And there's a lot of mistrust, right? Because we didn't have that kind of history. And I remember telling her, like, okay, but I have 10 reporters on my phone. And my young people said that if you ever do anything shady, I'm going to have to hit them up. And we will be the first one to blow the whistle on this whole thing. And we're going to go down with you. Like, so it was like that kind of thing. And there was a lot of like trust building and relationship building that needed to happen. But the reality is that, our daily, like our weekly meetings had a lot of like tension. And I say this because this is part of the win, right?
Mhm.
When you talk about restorative practice, you have to also do it. So there was a lot of restorative practice that needed to happen between that partnership in order for us to do the wins that would count, right? And so we did 3 years of that, and we created a menu with young people where they had their own town halls, and they created what it meant to be to have an alternative to school resource officers, right? And the criteria was to have 3 points, which was physical safety, emotional safety, and relational trust. So all of the options in that menu had to hit those things. And eventually we were able to design a process for local schools to come up with their own decision on whether or not they wanted police officers in the schools. And if they didn't, what would they use that money for? And they had to choose from that menu. And that's why I say now that 3 years later, it's been 10.9 million that has been, overall given to those schools that were given a real option of alternatives. And we have a 47% reduction of school resource officers in Chicago Public Schools, which is now the 4th largest school district in the nation. Last year, we were the 3rd. So it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I found fascinating about this, Maria, and thank you for all that. What I found fascinating about this is that you empowered the individual students to start contributing to the decision making. You empowered parents to be a part of the decision making, and everyone involved in the school, teachers, janitors, everybody kind of was involved in this process. It's very similar with the work that's been done in Oakland for that community responder, the macro responder. That really came out of a community-led process and a task force out of after the George Floyd murder. So yeah, I mean, horrific thing, horrible thing, but there does seem to be some very positive things that have come out of that. So, and I'll share a couple stats that I know about the Chicago Comprehensive Safety Plan as well, that truancies are down, suspensions are down like 86%, expulsions are down like 90%. I mean, these are incredible stats. So congratulations on that great work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think like the only thing I would definitely stress is like that youth voice component was really important for us. It needed to, while all the top-down decisions were happening, it needed to be something like decisions in the local schools needed to be informed and led by young people and the parents that were deeply connected into the issue. And the only thing we had to do was design a process that gave them that power balance and that shift. So one of the things that we did, for example, is like every school needed to have 2 parent and 2 students represented into their committee. And it'd be so that they can develop the plans together, and that they had to involve the community at least one time, and they had to do it either surveys or focus groups, however they see fit, but they needed to have that community voice.
Great, thank you, thank you. So Steve, I'm going to come to you next. You and I have had numerous conversations on this topic. So I know that you use the full breadth of your knowledge and experience from law enforcement and federal security. I know you use that lens when creating your approach to school safety. But what really has stood out for me in the conversations that we had is, I'm going to say this, it might seem corny to you, but this compassionate approach that you take to planning and prevention. It focuses, of course, on diligence. It focuses on including everybody within the school into the conversation. And it just brings to me, it's very trauma informed. You might not see it that way, but it is a very trauma informed approach to creating, to being prepared. So if you could share a little bit about how you do that.
Well, if you really dig deep into these, and usually it's young men, and research has shown that the indicators, the actions taken by 17 to 20-year-olds, violent actions, the indicators that potential threat is there start from as early as 10, 11, 12 years old. So teachers and school administrators and even parents see these indicators very early on. But unfortunately, I don't mean unfortunately, but our school system, 8th grade comes and they move on to high school. And a lot of times the grammar school principal goes, glad he's moved on to high school. We had issues with him in 7th and 8th grade, but he's out of here now, and he's on to high school. And tends to be a lack of communication between grammar school to high school, and a fear of what we get when we train our schools. We get a lot of faculty that push back and say, well, we don't want to label the child. Well, if he does something violent, you have no problem labeling a school shooter, but you're afraid of labeling them a problem at a younger age. And so when they graduate 8th grade and move on to high school, there's little communication. They don't want to have to deal with parents and have to deal with the school and saying, hey, you're getting this kid at your high school. He's a real problem. He was a problem here, and so forth. They don't want to label someone. And then by the time they're junior or senior, they've now matured. And it's that slow boil. And nobody snaps. We always hear about he just snapped. Nobody snaps. It's always a slow boil. You can see it coming. All the indicators are there. And that's in whether it's sexual predators or pursuers, kidnappers, child, Lamont, I'm sure this resonates with you, with the trafficking of women. It's a slow boil. They're showing all the indicators long before they take their action. And this is no different than violent students. And there's a research out there done by the Gavin DeBecker group, and I've worked a lot with them, and it's a Jocko effect, where they reach this level that they feel like they're justified. I've taken this process and moved it over to the terrorist world, and terrorism's no different. The violent acts by a terrorist and the violent acts by a junior in high school they both reach a level where they feel they're justified doing it. And so this compassion approach is, as schools, if we see those indicators, there should be reach out long before they get to that justification, that they don't feel like having an alternative, they don't care about the consequences, and they have the ability to complete the act. Once they reach that, there's really no turning back. And so to address this on the front end, we believe, and this is, again, the concept used by Joint Terrorism Task Forces, is getting out there ahead of the violent act, finding out who the bad actors are, and stopping them, interrupting, disrupting, and deterring them long before it happens. And the same concept would work in schools. Is if you see those indicators, if teachers are cognizant of indicators, if parents are put on notice that they're the intelligence collectors, and this is, we meet with the parents, we meet with the faculty, we meet with the administrators, and we train them on, frankly, intelligence collection. They need to see the signs and not just disregard them and say, oh, I heard my son in the back seat talking to his buddy, and he made a comment about a third student at school, and they're going, oh, wow, that's kind of concerning. Oh, well, glad it's not my kid. And they move on. That kind of little tidbit of intelligence collection needs to be passed on and needs to be owned. Our mantra at Tripwire is own the threat. Someone at the school needs to own those concerning behaviors. So we train one team at each school to be crisis managers, and they collate that information and they take proactive action. Is that calling mom and dad? Is that reaching out to the student? Many of these students, I'd say the majority of them, do this because they want the attention. It's a horrific violent act they commit, but it gets them the attention they've been craving for as many as 5, 6, 7 years prior. And once they've been reaching out for someone that whole time, and no one has responded. So ultimately, they do something that will guarantee them the attention they've been craving. And if the school was to give them that attention, and it could be a problem at home that you're not even aware of, and that's why we recommend your first call is to the family. And a recent one was a kid who walked on campus long after he left the school. He snuck onto a grade school campus, and they saw him, and principal's been there a long time, and fortunately she recognized him. She said, he went here as a grade school. I wonder why he snuck on campus. Well, they're trained by us. They picked up the phone, called the parents. They're going through a nasty divorce. He's being sent off to school. He's got all kinds of triggers going on in his life, and he's looking for someone to blame. And that put the crosshairs on the school. So they talk to the parents. They have a police connection. I highly recommend that schools don't just call the police. They have a police officer that is in their area, that knows them well, that's been on their campus, that has had a tour of their campus. The SWAT team has come in and toured their campus, has trained on their campus. These are all ways of giving a sense, a peace of mind and sense of security to parents, and including the parents in the safety process. So if the potential problem student gets the attention they're craving early on, many times you can prevent them from doing something. And the bad thing about safety and security is we probably all know there's no metric to measure it, right? If you connect with a student that 2 years later otherwise would have committed a violent act, you can never measure, you can never prove that you prevented a violent act, but you've taken the actions that give you peace of mind and a proactive operation to prevent violent acts.
Right. Yeah, we can't measure the absence of something, right? It's difficult to measure the absence of something.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Lamont, I'm going to come to you. Globally, it is estimated that 28 million people are trafficked a year. 28 million. And the hotline here in the United States is upward of 60,000 signals a year, where people are reaching out to them for some type of help or sharing information. I think that we have in our minds this myopic view of what a trafficker is, right? It's this coyote that's coming over the border with migrants and, you know, trafficking people this way. So if you could share a little bit more about what the real impacts of human trafficking are, that it's not this myopic view, that it really is more widespread than we can think, and it's coming at us in all different ways.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Maria and Stephen, for what you do. Stephen, I live pretty close to Sandy Hook and know some first responders that had to respond after the fact.
Right.
Played a music gig that I had scheduled prior to that, but they just happened to be 2 weeks after that event, and a lot of the teachers showed up. It was the first time many of them were out of their house. And so it's very close to us, and
Right.
those of us that live in this part of Connecticut. Arlene, thanks again for having me and for your question, and for this de-siloing of the violence prevention. I really appreciate that. Yeah, we have to do a lot of myth busting. You know, the white van abduction, Walmart parking lot, you know, the conspiracy theories then about abducting children and using them for adrenochrome. And that's just been such a sideshow. That's a nice way that I'll put it. And we end up having to do some myth busting, because trafficking is usually done, it's usually done by someone the victim knows or thinks they know. Can it be abduction? Yes. Can it be sort of the kidnapping thing? Yes, but rarely it's by someone you know or think that you know. So we go into a school system or a community, and even before we start looking at doing trainings for the staff, before we bring in our award-winning curriculum called Lights, I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit, we try to work with the community to identify the gaps. Where are the gaps in a response? You can't just go in, you know, some organizations will come in and just do an assembly, which why would you talk about such a traumatic topic and not be able to read the room to follow up with? So we always have 2 facilitators in the room, because, you know, the body language, you know, is a form of communication, and we need to be paying attention to that. We have activities that specifically give youth opportunities to do things like co-write a song with one of the characters, and they'll, in the fill in the blank sections, they'll start to disclose something. And initially it might be something like bullying or suicidal ideation, but once the social worker or the counselor follows up, many times it is something like trafficking behind the scenes or online exploitation. So we go in and we work with, so I'll give you an example. In New York City, we initially went to the mayor's office, and we started working with various departments within the mayor's office. Then we got put in touch with the Department of Education, and similar to, I think it was Maria or Arlene talking about all the trainings, but yes, it's all school staff, because it could be a janitor that a youth, you know, feels comfortable with. It could be the lunch lady, could be a crossing guard. So we believe in training everyone in the school system, at least at the basic knowledge of what human trafficking could look like. Not just myth busting, but also bias busting. Mm-hmm. Youth are often misidentified as victims. I'll give you an example. Because they're promiscuous, or they're sexually active. They just like to have lots of sex. So I had a Christmas party at my house. We have one every year, and this would have been 1.5 years ago now. This person came up to me and she said, "Oh, it's so great that you're helping those kids over there. If I can ever volunteer for your organization to help those kids way over there," thinking I still worked in Asia with my previous organization, but I didn't want to get into it as a Christmas party. I'm like, okay. Then, well, 2 months later, she calls. Her own stepdaughter was being trafficked underneath, while she was going to school, while she was living underneath her roof. She was 15 years old, and the mother just thought she was being promiscuous, until she saw on the cell phone, "You have 3 more bodies," which is a way of saying a quota. Often victims are told, you can't leave this hotel room, or this consequence will happen unless you come up with, you know, $1,000 a night or $2,000 a night or whatever it is. So, so we like to go in and make sure that the gaps are identified, and then that even community-based organizations that work with the school system are trained. And so we also do consultations, TAs with organizations that help bring them to the next level and the next level of understanding and being able to respond. Because even though this is prevention work, numbers actually go up. The numbers of identifications go up. We, you know, similar to Stephen and Arlene, I know we've talked about this at the summer summit or what we had, but this whole idea of it's hard to track the absence of something. What we can track is an increase in knowledge. And so far, our curriculum has proven to have a 90% increase in knowledge about human trafficking and the tactics that are used. And then over an 85% increase for a willingness to reach out for help. And I think that's really important to be able to track that as well. So we look forward at the end of our 5-year partnership with the Department of Education to actually have some really solid numbers, you know, to create some white papers that we can share, because data around this is really difficult to nail down, because victims aren't, because it's such a harmful, traumatizing experience. They're not raising their hands saying, you know, I'm a victim. And many times they don't even have the language to know. They just think, maybe my boyfriend's bad. He makes me do things, or whatever, you know, the language that they put it in. So, so we're looking forward to being able to contribute that to the violence prevention movement. I don't know if I want to continue going, but maybe I'll just save some of the rest of it for a little later and let you ask some more questions.
I do have a follow-up question
Yeah.
for you, Lamont. I think it's important that our participants today kind of get a feel for what the different types of trafficking are. I'm so happy. I mean, happy it's not a good word to say about this, but I'm pleased. I'm ecstatic that this is now come into your conversation, into the human trafficking conversation, is a trafficking of athletes. How coaches are moving athletes across state lines, or moving them and putting them in positions to interact with other athletes or other coaches. So I don't think that falls on people's minds as human trafficking. But your organization is clearly setting standards like, hey, this is human trafficking. This is, and lobbying and doing work on a legislative level to have these labeled as such.
Yes, yes. So there's 2 types of human trafficking. We'll sort of put the categories under labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Now, then there's sort of not subcategories. Those just express themselves in different ways. So underneath, so on the sex trafficking side, of course, you have what we call domestic minor trafficking. That's the trafficking of, you know, a local person. The tactics, the story that we tell is of and they're all based on true stories. By the way, our curriculum was written with survivors. All of our early pilot sessions were piloted with survivors. And so it's survivor informed, it's trauma informed. All of our stories are based on these lived experiences. So the first story that we share is about and it's based on a true story again. Someone who lost their father while she was in middle school, wanted to be a musician like her dad was, ended up being lured in by someone who played the fake father role, played the fake agent. I can help your music career. Played the fake boyfriend. You know, those are all very common tactics used in the US and in Canada for trafficking. And helping people to spot those signs, they learn to see the force, fraud, and coercion. Those are the legal elements, the tactics that are used in human trafficking, and they spot them in the sign. They're like, that's when violence was used against her to keep her compliant. That's when coercion happened, the threats against her and her family. That's when here's the fraud. You know, she was supposed to meet a music agent. It didn't happen. So they're learning all these common tactics so that they can better protect themselves. And along with domestic minor sex trafficking, of course, you have the trafficking of newcomers, the immigrant community. An interesting thing to note is sometimes they're trafficked, you know, before they arrive, on the journey here, or while they're here. if that happens to a newcomer anywhere along the way, they're actually eligible for something called a T visa, and they get fast tracked to the front of the line for services. The visa still takes a while because it's kind of backlogged, but they do get fast tracked for better services. And those of you that work with the newcomer community, that's a really important thing to know, because lots of times they're scared to talk to someone they feel is in a position of authority. They're scared they're, going to be deported and all of that, but they need to know their rights, and they need to know that they can get services. So that's, of course, another major one. Then, of course, there's labor trafficking. Now, you might be thinking about like factories and farms and that kind of thing. Yes, that happens in the US as well. But the story that we tell is about a kid selling candy on the subway. I don't know what cities y'all live in, but have you ever seen youth
Yes.
selling candy, water, that kind of thing? I'm not saying all kids, Girl Scouts are being trafficked, but sometimes it's gang involved, or sometimes it's an individual trafficker who is exploiting youth in these candy selling schemes. When we talk about this in New York, soon thereafter, a social worker will call 2 or 3 days later and say, I got a candy kid. One recently was this youth was given a flyer outside of his school, about 2 or 3 blocks away, then was being taken with some other youth, boys and girls, to suburbs of New York City. The van driver and the recruiter was a convicted child predator, and was also taking videos, exploitative videos and stuff in the van rides. And so again, when we talk about these things, the alarm bells go off for the educators especially. And if it's the youth, then they know that they have rights and can reach out. I won't take you through all 10 super long, but online exploitation, basically the fastest growing crime against our children is something called sextortion. And that is where a nude is shared with someone they feel they trust. And then that nude image or video is used to blackmail them to get them to do things. It could be to hook up in person, where the youth is raped. It could be for money. And trigger warning, there is a massive spike in death by suicides because of sextortion. So you've got that. You've got gang-related trafficking. You've got the fake job offers, familial trafficking, where we teach youth that they have to be loyal to themselves first. Their own family members are trafficking them. And we do come across this. And, the lies of what happens in the family stays in the family don't apply here. That does not apply when a youth is being harmed. So learning to be loyal to oneself first. We deal with something called survival sex, where youth that are unhoused, are forced to exchange their bodies for a place to stay. And then we also, the last thing I'll say is, we're the only curriculum that I know of that deals with the reality that not only are youth being recruited and groomed as victims, they're also being recruited and groomed as perpetrators. Older traffickers are using younger people, sometimes even sex trafficking victims, to recruit others. So it's peers recruiting peers, and it's just so much more deceptive that way. And there might even be a bit of a honeymoon phase. Come to this party, maybe even a flight somewhere, and then all of a sudden you realize that you don't have autonomy over your body. You don't control any of the money. There's violence all along the way, and so it turns. So yeah, those are the sort of the snapshot of the 10 most common ways that youth are trafficked or exploited.
Thank you, Lamont. I appreciate that. And just another reminder, if you're feeling activated during this conversation, please take care of yourself. This is going to go out to all 3 of you. With PAVE, during PAVE's training, we do what's called the spectrum of awareness, or what's going on. It's a simple question, simple but not easy. What's going on, right? And all of you have already kind of touched on it. We need to empower the individual to feel strong enough to ask this question, to learn how to ask this question of themselves and their community. The situational awareness, the tool and the skills to be situationally aware, to ask this question, what is going on? That can mean Like, what's going on with my friend? They seem a little different today. What's going on with the student? They seem a little different today. Things just don't seem to be normal, right? What's going on? There's a backpack laying there. It's a simple question. What's going on? This kid who normally hasn't been in a financial position to hit every hockey tournament in North America is now able to hit every hockey tournament in North America. But all of a sudden they hate hockey. So these are all questions. So we really at PAVE, we really try to create this internal set of skills to be more situationally aware, to be able to ask what's going on, and then be an upstander and have some conversations around them. So I know, Steve, you have a great example of the Gabby Guilford shooting. I'd love you to share a little bit of information about how everybody told you after there were signs. How many people during the investigation told you that there were signs that, yeah, this guy just seemed a little off. And then also, Lamont, if you could think about it in your sector on how there are these signs, and Maria, if you feel like chiming in as well on students socially withdrawing or whatever signs that came up during your conversation on psychological safety. Steve?
Yeah, thank you. So we'll touch on the Gabrielle Gifford's shooting. I was the on-scene commander for that operation, and but it's not unique to that. We see it on TV all the time when the students of a school or the teachers of a school or friends of the family of the shooter are interviewed afterwards. The theme is consistent, right? I'm not surprised it was him. Yeah, he was kind of a loner. He was a little different. Yeah, the shooting up in, I believe it was in Michigan, where the students said afterwards, oh yeah, he kept a list of girls that he wanted to commit violence to. How did this all happen and the school not know about it? But in the Gabrielle Gifford's case, we interviewed people afterwards, and one of the particular ones was a student. He went to Pima County Community College here in Arizona, and I'm in Scottsdale, Arizona, by the way. I mentioned that, but here in Arizona, and we interviewed students from his classroom, and one particular young woman said, well, during the semester, she started sitting in the first row, first seat, right inside the door, and she took notes in class with her purse on her lap. And the reason she did that was she was afraid he was going to do something one day, and she wanted to be able to just jump up and run out the door. So if the students could see this, how did the teachers not see it? The teachers clearly see it. So this is, to me, the empowerment part in what I talk to the teachers about when we do the faculty training, is letting them know that when you see those indicators, don't just brush them off. Now, it doesn't indicate a violent act, but it does indicate a potential problem. And Arlene, you nailed it. When all of a sudden the most bubbly little kid in this class turns into the quietest kid in the class, that's an indicator. There's a change. Now, it could be something as simple as their dog died, right? Their grandmother died. Something,
but why wouldn't we want to be compassionate and know about that? And
exactly, and this is what we say, and this is exactly what we tell them is, what's wrong with pulling them aside and saying, is everything okay? They're looking for someone to talk to them, to connect with them, and for some reason they're not getting that. Now, again, if it's a and I don't dismiss that if it's a fourth or fifth grader, because in Arkansas, it was a fourth grader and a fifth grader who laid in wait in the woods outside of the school and waited for the kids to come out to recess and shot the kids in the playground. And they were in the fourth and fifth grade. So I don't dismiss that grammar school kids can get to that point, and they feed off each other. But the point is that even at the younger ages, and then 7th and 8th grade, and then we all know 8th, 9th, and 10th grade, that junior high range, is where lots of crazy things are going on in your world, right? We've all lived through it. You know, you're finding your way, and if things aren't going well, there's changes in that in the personality, and we as a whole team, the entire school, the gym teacher, the music teacher, the classroom teacher, the principal, the family, that everyone has to notice these changes and say, okay, let's take a quick look here and see what's going on. And so, yeah, and you know, that we did get all kinds of feedback on Jared Lochner, the shooter, the Gabrielle Giffords case, that there were years of indicators leading up to that.
This is what amazes me, right? I mean, I read a long time ago that there was this, it was like 15 things or 16 things happened before something turned into a full-blown physical event.
So the research has shown that there are usually 5 to 10 indicators within 6 months of the event. 5 to 10, and all those indicators were witnessed by a family member or someone at the school. So all the indicators are there. I mean, to my earlier point, no one just snaps. It's a slow boil, and all those indicators are there.
Right.
Before someone needs to own it.
Yeah, yeah. Before I let Lamont and Maria chime in, I just want to point out, when we do our employee experience survey, what we're hearing from people in the workplace is that there's a sense of indifference. There's a lack of trust in the system to report. There's a, you know, it wasn't bad enough. It didn't rise to the level for me to say something, you know.
But Arlene, let me chime in one more time. But all of that is a societal thing on our side.
Yes, I agree.
We're more, it's not so much it didn't rise. We don't want to be the one to say it.
I agree.
And,
I agree. There's some of that.
Yeah. You don't want to be the person who is the whiner, the complainer. We all have this. We're the only species who cross-examines our feelings. Situational awareness is so key. When the antelope walks up to the pond over in Africa and starts getting a drink and turns and looks and the lion's coming, the antelope doesn't go, hey, looks like he ate lunch already. I think I'm good, right? That antelope gets out of there. We're the only species that cross-examines our feelings. And when we know there's something wrong, we try to convince ourselves that maybe it's not that bad. I always say the number one security risk is denial. So,
thank you, thank you. That's a good visual on that. Thank you, Steve. Lamont, do you want to talk about, you know, that situational awareness, or those things, those indicators that we're just missing?
Yeah, before I jump into some indicators, I just want to kind of piggyback on what Stephen just said. And what you were implying as well, Arlene. We need to listen to our youth, to what they say, and behavior is also a language. And many times survivors have told us, I tried to tell an adult and no one believed me, or they judged me. And so first and foremost, we need to do a better job listening to our youth, to listen to what they're telling us. There are, of course, some, I'll just give some anecdotes for you know, some success stories, really, from the staff that we've trained in various schools. So one thing we talk to the staff about is looking for patterns. In addition to New York, we also work in the Washington, D.C. public school system. And during one of the trainings, one of the staff members mentioned about one of the students going to Vegas and missing school for like 2 weeks. And then another social worker was like, yeah, that happened with one of my students. That happened with one of my students. They got together, talked. There was a whole trafficking ring, taking DC girls to Vegas. So watching for those patterns is really important. We also train school safety officers, and there's, you know, one story of a red Mercedes. I know that sounds sort of like conspiratorial, like the white van, but look, if a red Mercedes keeps showing up at various places where youth are being trafficked, you gotta pay attention. And so don't ignore those signs when pay attention to those details. You know, it showed up at the mother's house and try to get a girl back who had previously been trafficked by these folks. The mother approached the car. They brought out a gun, let her know that she was not going to have a conversation right there. And then they pieced it together that that car was showing up at a school and interacting with a lot of students. And then thankfully that those folks got busted. Hotel key cards is a thing, you know, listening to youth even talk amongst each other, maybe about trips to hotels. That's a big one. Now it's Airbnb, sort of parties at Airbnb. Hey, we went up to this party in Long Island and it was the Airbnb, and, you know, but something happened when I was drugged. And then that sometimes is a pattern within a certain school system. You've got, you know, youth recruiting youth into these situations and then taking money from buyers that are coming to take advantage of them in those situations. This was a really good success story. We also talk about forced criminality that falls underneath labor trafficking. So in the sporting world, in like you mentioned about the hockey, but what's happening in New York City are youth can't afford to go up to these tournaments. They can't afford to, you know, do all the things that wealthier communities can. So gangs are sponsoring athletes. Well, you don't get anything for free. So now you have to run this stolen credit card. Boom, that's a federal crime. We got you on camera. Now you've got to do this for us. So it's a whole reeling in process, and it's a form of trafficking. And we're working with the Brooklyn DA, and we need to do more trainings with judges and prosecutors because they don't even understand much about this. But thankfully, a school principal, after one of our trainings, he called our main contact at the DOE, who called us and said, hey, there's a boy who with an open locker that's full of drugs. We noticed that he was starting to hang out with a different crowd. We noticed his grades plummeted, also a sign to watch out for. And we were just going to suspend him and call the cops. But then we thought, wow, I wonder if he's being coerced by a gang to do this. And he left the locker open on purpose. And that's exactly what happened.
Wow.
So those are the kind of things that we're grateful that we hear the intervention in those early stages. So yeah, those are some of the indicators. I will just touch on some of the indicators for labor trafficking, because I've been mostly talking about sex trafficking. If a youth is missing school, it's a problem. If a youth is can't quit their job, that's a problem. If they're paying off a debt, it's illegal to make a youth pay off a debt. So we have to do some harm reduction, especially around the newcomer community who feel like, you know, they have to pay off these debts. And so you have to be really careful with that, but you do have to let them know their rights. You do have to let them know that they can't miss school. They need to have autonomy over their situations, and they can't be doing, you know, jobs that are dangerous and could bring harm to them. So those are some of the indicators on something that would just go from kids working after school and weekends to being labor exploitation.
Thank you, Lamont. I just know your example of the basketball team and the sponsorship of the athlete. I just know the struggles that my parents went through to get me to the events that I wanted to go to or needed to get to. I don't know. I don't know what would have happened if someone would have presented themselves and said, hey, we can get Arlene to that big tournament that she needs to get to. She's number 2 now. She could be number 1 if she gets to this tournament. Well, we can't afford it. Well, we can, you know? Yeah. So yeah, it is, that one really hit home for me when you shared that example, the other conference. So we only have a few minutes, but I do want to let Maria chime in here because I know they are giving creative ways in this whole school safety system, creative ways for people to heal or find support. Maria?
Yeah, and I just wanted to just kind of give a shout out to the you know, to Stephen and Lamont. I think like there's different approaches to creating safety. There's individual safety that does impact the community safety, right? And there's proactive safety that is informed by years of experience of how to approach it in a way that builds ownership. And I think that, like, you know, our approach is like somewhere in the middle where it talks about, you know, it's really about the cultural shift. A lot of people think that, like, oh, if we get rid of police officers, we're safe. Or if we add police officers, we're safe. the reality is that it's a process about building ownership within that building and to the other institutions across that community that creates that safety. And the way that you can create that safety is by building ownership, right? If you own something, you take care of it. And the way that you own something is you build the relationships and the connections to that community. I would share, like, part of the reason why I got into this work, my oldest brother, he was over the age of 21 by the time that we got our visa to come to America. We're from Philippines. The average wait is 23 years. We waited 13. We were scared just to do another 13 years of waiting. So by the time our visas came, my brother was over the age of 21 and my family had to be separated. Because my family was separated, my brother went through a lot of mental health issues, a lot of drinking. 3 years later, he got liver cancer. His emergency visa came 2 days after he passed. And when I was going through that, there was a lot of like hopelessness and a lot of like, I don't understand why this is happening. I was in middle school. I went into high school. I didn't know how to grieve. I ended up dropping out of high school. They moved me into an alternative school because they said I was 17, I might as well drop out when they caught me cutting class. And then they transferred me. And when they did that, I was still depressed. So I still didn't go to school. So I got kicked out of alternative school. And the reason why, when I was going through all that, I had a lot of suicidal tendencies. I didn't really think I was going to turn 17, which is weird, right? Because you're 16. A lot of my family members were like, you're 16. What are you depressed about? Like, why are you sad? We left the country. We have opportunities here. Why are you sad? And I think, like, I bring that story up because the reason why I didn't go through with it was because I had created connections at Communities United. I was at a point in my organizing where I felt like my life wasn't my own. Like, I had a responsibility to my community that I had to show up because they invested in me. So I have to give back. And it's very similar to the approach, that the way that we should approach safety in our schools, right? Like, if people feel ownership to that school, they'll take care of it. If there's no shame in saying like, oh, I see that, okay, then let's claim it, let's address it, then things can get a little better, right? And the last thing that I would just mention is that outside of, incarcerated folks, if you look at like the way that we look at young people, like we tell them what to dress, how to dress, when to leave, when to come back, how to act, how to talk, what to eat, when to eat, like all those things, right? If we put that in any other group, it would either be racist or it would be like some sort of like a really messed up like thing. But we do that with young people because they're young and they can't decide for themselves. Therefore, we don't put any weight into what they're saying. But the reality is that wisdom comes in all places and in all ages, right? So when young people are saying, I don't feel safe, it's our responsibility to listen, right? And to look for those signs, just like what Lamont and Stephen were talking about. So I just think that, when we approach whatever issue we're trying to address, it's just really important that you and us, like, we connect with the survivors and the people that are going through it first, so that we have that wisdom when we talk about addressing those issues.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for that. Wow. So we only have we'll have maybe 10 minutes or so, 10 to 15 minutes in our breakout session, but I still would like to give you a little smaller access to ask questions to our panelists. Before we move into the chat room and to our breakout sessions, I just want to share with you a couple questions that we have, so maybe our panelists can think about them. Trafficking can also happen at home, and educators may not have any idea the child is being used. How can we help educators identify such issue? Please keep that in mind, Lamont, in your breakout. And then there is another question I want to share in the chat. How do we address the conspiracy of silence, as well as the legal and social constraints around freedom to report? And then it was tough to learn when kids at the safe house I worked at would come to the house and stay long enough to make a friend that they would convince them to leave, taking them back to the traffickers. How do we identify actually healthy, safe places for youth victims of trafficking? Okay, so with those couple questions in mind, we're going to move to our breakout sessions. I'm sure that we have some good questions coming from our participants. See you in a little bit.
All right, everybody. So do we want to start with one of those questions that Arlene had volleyed into our net, so to speak, about helping teachers identify indicators of potential trafficking happening in the home?
Yeah,
Mike, you want to start?
that's a tricky one because we make sure that when there are signs of trafficking, that they don't just call home without knowing first if the family are involved in the trafficking. And there's different protocol, at least in New York City, for how to report that. If a family's involved, it really falls under child abuse and goes to state central registry. So we work closely with the NYPD Human Trafficking Squad. It's part of the Special Victims Unit, and they show up plainclothes and they do the conversations with the youth. They're the experts, because we don't want the social workers digging too deep. Just enough information to then pass it off. And we definitely don't want like this administrator and this school staff and this interrogating the youth, right? It has to be done very delicately, especially if there's a suspicion that the family is involved. And that does happen. We have cases right now where the family members are involved in the trafficking. So it is part of our training, and it's tricky.
Wow. So that sounds like that's the first step. If there is suspicion of any trafficking being perpetrated by a family member, that the school will then call this task force to then come in and so many words, interview the student on school property.
Yep. And they do it very delicately, without pushing too much, again, around the family. You want to jump in here, Mandy?
Well, I just have a quick question for both of you since I have you here, and I kind of want to bring it in for myself as a parent. What would you tell your children, or suggest I tell my children to look out for themselves, and also indicators something might not be right with my own child, as hard as that is to say in a school situation?
Well, I'll jump in. There's two ways to look at this. One is, we all know that our kids do things around their friends and even at school that they wouldn't do around you. So the concerning behavior is probably more recognized at school or by their friends or by their friends' parents than they would be by you, because they're on guard when they're with mom and dad, right? So there was one question in the queue about how do we break this silence. One of the things we tell the school is you make it a policy. I mean, if you leave it up to the person, like I touched on in my last comments, if you leave it up to us to say that doesn't look right, we cross-examine ourselves and we go, I'm just being way overcautious and so forth. But at a school, if the school makes it a policy and mandates that if you see something unusual, you're required to report. It may mean nothing, but it takes the burden off the faculty, the teachers. And this is mostly grade school and high school. Colleges, not so much, but grade school and high school, it takes the burden off the teacher, and they feel more comfortable saying, well, I really don't want to report this, but I have to. By policy, they make me report it, right? So that if the school does that, and then you are fully involved with your kid's school, then you will know that they will do that. And then part of their ownership, if the entire process we train them on is in place, they'll see the concerning behavior. They're mandated to report it. It goes to the crisis manager, the person we've trained to own it, to Maria's point, ownership. They own it. One of their standard SOPs or mandated policies is to then call the parents. So then you will get notified. Your daughter, your son, your child is just showed some indicators that is everything all right. You've built that network now.
Got it.
Where they've got a whole set of resources that pass that information on.
Great
If
question.
that helps.
Thank you.
Don, did you want to say something?
Yeah, we had a question from Huva. How do you identify actually healthy, safe places for youth victims of trafficking?
How do we identify safe places for youth victims of trafficking? So there are organizations that we work with and that the NYPD or DC public schools, depending on where we are, that are trained to and certified to take in youth survivors of trafficking. We do some training and consultation. There's one group, for example, that actually utilizes survivors in their 20s as mentors for younger survivors, because they're like, they get me. they get what's going on here. These other adults don't have a clue. So utilizing other survivors to make sure that the program is survivor informed, and then also they can be mentors. And we have a survivor consultant that we work with before partnering with the Safe Home organization. And then with my previous organization, we expanded a lot of safe homes. And so, hiring an expert survivor care director will be a next step for us before we have our own housing. And just making sure all the staff are properly and adequately trained. But it's tough. You have trauma bonding is a real problem with some of the survivors. Even though they experienced a lot of harm, you could think of it like a domestic violence situation where they may not want to feel like, turn against this person who, for many victims, it's the first time they felt love or belonging. So you're dealing with a lot of those elements as well. But yeah, safe places for survivors, there aren't enough of them. And as someone mentioned earlier, I can't remember her name, but sometimes they're recruited out of shelters. And that happens as well. So we need a lot more safe places. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Thanks. Does anybody have any questions before I launch into another one? Krista?
Yeah, so I have a question about resources. I think it was Stephen that talked about seems like the lockdown drills are the standard now for response. And I'm wondering if you're finding that there's resources for more of these prevention activities for both of you. Or is it more that we have therapists, they can deal with any trafficking, and we have lockdown drills, and that's the solution for any, mass events? And so I'm just wondering what you're encountering as far as resources and sort of that cultural response in schools.
I'll jump in, Lamont, and then you can you jump in. The sad reality is that, like I said, that to me the biggest threat to security is denial. And although school shootings, and I'll use those as an example other than workplace violence, the odds of it happening at a school is very, 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 very slim. And so that's what school administrators hang their hat on, is that it probably won't happen. And therefore, the policies mandated by whether it's school districts or the school itself is we have to do lockdown drills twice a year. And so it's a checkbox, right? We did our lockdown drill twice a year. Like I said at the beginning, the lockdown drill has become the old school fire drill, right? It's mandatory. You have to do it twice a year. And they reach out to resources, to your point, that are cost the least. So Department of Homeland Security will send a team out and do run, hide, fight. And that's free. And they can do a run, hide, fight drill. And again, it checks a block. So the resources are out there, but if a school really wants to do become the safe school that we would love to see every school, it would take reaching out to private consultants and people coming in and doing extensive training. And it's the piece that, so people talk about arming teachers, right? Letting teachers have weapons. And everyone just thinks of a teacher with a gun on their hip, right? But what comes with that? It comes quarterly training and ammunition and all the things that come with being proficient with whatever tool. And a gun's just a tool. That's all it is to provide safety and security. No one thinks of the big investment part of it. Safety and security is a big investment. So to answer your question, the resources are out there. It's all about what the school's willing to pay to get the proper and deep training, or is it easier to just have a DHS person come in and do run, hide, fight? And that's what you battle with on the resource side. I hope that helps.
That's really interesting. And I'm just going to say something really quick that ties to a previous conversation that we had internally, is that, you know, much like with librarians who are now, they've transformed into more social workers than they have library science, right? So now there's this kind of perceived shift that needs to take place with, you know, school teachers in becoming somewhat like security experts within their school. How do we rectify that for our teachers? Because, you know, much like with librarians, like that's not what I signed up for with, you know, becoming a social worker. You do have a lot of teachers. I have family that have been teachers, and they kind of were just like, I'm done because this is nuts. How do we shift that perception for teachers that they're already doing more than they're supposed to and still getting paid less than they should be when it comes to violence prevention and resources?
That's a great question. And I agree. I say this all the time. We're asking more and more on the safety and security side of our teachers. And it's causing that some embrace it. Some are welcome additional education and a different skill set. And I've had teachers come to me and say, yeah, do you teach firearms training? I would love to get more proficient in firearms and so forth. So some of them embrace it and want to take on the responsibility. But I safely say the vast majority, to your point, say, hey, I came here to teach. This is what I do. I teach and I go home. I don't, the safety and security is someone else's role. I think in this changing world, and I teach a whole topic on expectations, whether it's national security down to school security. Parents expect more now out of the schools, rightly or wrongly. The parents expect teachers and administrators at schools to be more cognizant. And I talk to parents, I meet with the parents of the schools we train, and they just want peace of mind that their school administrators and faculty members are cognizant of safety and security and understand it and so forth. So it's the way we're going. So teachers are going to have to either embrace that or, you know, make a tough, life-changing decision.
Understood.
Yeah.
The other part of that question that you had me thinking is that, you know, parents have this expectation of the schools like giving more and being more cognizant of safety and security, but does the school put that then back on the parents? Like this is a partnership, right? Part of this ownership is a partnership where the parents have to participate in the intelligence gathering, in the communication, in the ownership of, you know, little Johnny is kind of acting a little, you know, out of character right now. I know we're going through a divorce, XYZ, just wanted to let you know. Like,
Oh, absolutely.
is there that as part of the
Yes.
training?
Yes, absolutely. We bring in all three groups. We talk to the administrators specifically as the crisis managers. We talk to the faculty members and what their role is, and then we meet with the parents. We have the school invites all the parents of all their children to several sessions, and we talk to them, and we put it on them as the intelligence collectors because they're the ones at gymnastics class, at their little league field, driving the kids in their minivan to be stereotypical, but in their vehicles, they've got the kids and they're hearing the conversations. And when the kids are together, they're saying things unfiltered.
Yeah.
You need to listen. You need to not be on your phones. Don't be texting with your friends. Listen to their conversations and be intelligence collectors, because they may say one thing that would indicate that one of their friends is having a tough time. And that's what you give back to the school. And they've got the machine in place on campus to address that. So you're right. It's a holistic approach. And yes, we do.
Wonderful. Does anybody else have any questions? Cassandra? No, nothing at this time. One final thought. I kind of wanted to go back to the conspiracy of silence, which plays into that ownership piece that we've been kind of threading throughout this entire breakout room. Is there any other things that you can add to help break that conspiracy of silence? I know that denial is a huge part of that, because when there's denial front and center, nobody wants to admit or talk about it. I know we have like 2 seconds. So if there's any final thoughts on that, that'd be appreciated. And if there isn't, that's okay too.
I've seen when, certain communities, have these, what happens here stays here sort of thing, having people from those same communities address that head on, and just how we can't leave harming children into that equation, that doesn't fit. And so, yeah, I would just say just making sure that you're hearing and utilizing the voices from specific communities rather than some outsider trying to like impose their beliefs on, what we should be doing. So I would say that's been successful. And I really appreciate just the very clear protocols that Stephen has been talking about. That's really clear. And if you guys work in community school districts, making sure that we know what to do. I used to play baseball, and my coach was always like, know what you're going to do with the ball before it comes. Is it going to third and then like, so we gotta play that game well, and work with our partners well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What keeps coming up for me is accountability. Accountability has been transgressed into a dirty word, and it really isn't. It is more ownership than blame. So thank you, guys.
Ownership's the key. Ownership's the key.
Yes, ownership is key. All right, I'm sure Nikki's going to be pulling us out.
Okay.
All right, feel
Before
free
she
to
pulls us out, I just want to say, just like shout out to Dr. Harmon and Heather. Nice to see you. Cassandra, nice to see you, of course. All y'all. John.
Yeah. Pleasure meeting you, Lamont, and the rest of the gang. I appreciate you inviting me every year.
Oh, no problem. We're going to meet in the big room before we sign off.
Yeah,
okay.
We're not leaving.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Don't leave, Steve. Okay.
Don't leave.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, Mom.
Hi, Mom.
So please, do we have any questions first for Maria on this panel? Would anyone like to share a question? Deb, I see wow, I got 10 questions I want to ask. Please, you can just raise your hand and then we'd be happy to hear your question. Go for it, Deb.
Thanks, because I can't find the hand to raise. So no, this has been an amazing kind of, I just really, I could listen to you all for hours. But Maria, I was curious about, how wonderful the movement to kind of decrease or get rid of the resource officers in so many schools and how successful that has been. how difficult of a sell that was to the schools themselves, right? Because there tends to be this desire to have a quick fix and feeling like pushing that brawn into the environment will quiet things down when things feel really out of control. So I could see administrators and educators really fighting that because they feel overstressed already. So I'm just curious about how you approached that process with them to help earn their trust in giving it a try, you know, moving towards that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's always like, honestly, like when people like, when all of these issues were happening at first, we were pushing for police officers to get out of schools, like all of them at once, right? Because we believe that young people, like our young people, were mentioning that they feel safer without police officers in schools. However, that's not how it played out in Chicago public schools. And, you know, the mayor at the time was talking about, well, that's not my decision. It's the Board of Education's issue. And the Board of Education was like, that's not our thing. You got to go to the local school councils. And so when all of that happened and the process was started with whole school safety, it had to be a balance. It had to be a balance of, you have to make a choice as a school, but it also has to be like a real choice. So before this process, people would be like, oh, you know, you need to get rid of your police, or, you know, or just keep them. But there wasn't an incentive as to really take a look at safety, right? Because it's an important issue. It's a complex issue. It's an issue that is highly emotional. And honestly, people would rather not talk about it because it's a lot easier. But the reality is that this is important. And so we had to put a lot of things in place as a policy through the process. So for example, if your school has an SRO and you don't want to participate in this, you automatically get rid of your SROs. You have to participate in this process so that you have to decide what's best for that money to go into. Another thing that we fought the district on, but not really fought, but more like this has to be a part of the process, is that if you vote out a police officer, you need to give the school money, because really, if you're not going to give them money, then what you're saying is that, hey, I'm going to take away your extra adult in the building. And that's the only choice you have. So that's not real. That's not conceivable. You got to give them the money back. And you can, you know, you can't take that money, because a lot of other school districts, they took the money, they took the SROs away, but then they gave them private security that was armed. And so the schools like couldn't even do anything about them anymore. And it got worse because they were a private entity. They couldn't be held publicly accountable. So we had to, that's why we created that menu that hit the 3 points of safety that kind of gets to the cultural like portion of that safety. So it was a balance with, you know, with the schools. They had to go through the process, right? But we gave them real options to do, like we gave them a real choice, so that they have some autonomy on like what that money should look like. And then on top of that, we did a lot of citywide webinars. We did, last year, we actually did individual school consultings, like Communities United has a whole, like an entire school, like where we went through the process with them and we talked to them, because we came in as experts of community engagement. So we like talk them through like, okay, well, this is what you could do with your school. Like, this is how you could engage them. You know, this is how you interpret the data. You know, what do you think about that? So we try to be as supportive as possible, but we do have to, you know, the resolution actually reads that at some point, we don't want police officers in our schools, but we're not going to force you to do it right away. We're going to lead you through the process, and that process is going to be community led.
Maria, what could you share some of the alternatives real quick that
Sure.
money has been allocated to?
So some of the things that the schools opted out for, some of them did do security guards, which is a lot less, and they are not armed and they are not police officers. So it's a different kind of relationship. But most of them did social emotional learning programming. So a lot of them like hired restorative justice coordinators. Some of them did a student representative, like a student risk liaison. So that person that really like targets like young people who feel like they're kind of falling off of the school. Some of them did yeah, a lot of them actually hired a restorative justice coordinator because a lot of them needed to have that alternative to, you know, holding young people accountable. Some of them also did peace rooms, or having like rooms where young people could be themselves and they could like talk to someone about it. So that's the beauty of the process, right? The menu included such a huge menu, but it was all around like restorative practice. It was around like, you know, spaces for young people, or any other resources that could really get to the alternatives of what you could do with young people if there is a behavioral issue. And the beauty of the process is that the schools get to decide what that money can be spent on. So each police officer, because usually the schools would have two, one would cost about 80,000. So that's a lot of money. And it's a reoccurring money. So it's not like, oh, you voted them out in 2021, in 2022, you don't get anything. You still get that money. So that it's that existing support. And it took a lot of convincing because it was we had meetings with the Board of Education to kind of educate them on the issue and let them know that this is what the process looks like and to get buy-in. And the steering committee still reports to the Board of Education to talk about the process that we've gone through.
And I'll just chime in a little bit, Maria, from what I remember as well. You had like teacher union representatives at the table, you had janitors at the table, you had students, you had parents, you had principals, you had a lot. It really was an inclusive group that worked on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like, you know, again, every school looked different because every school looks different in Chicago, but they had to have some common themes, right? Like you have to have the administrators of the school present in the planning. You had to have a couple of parents, a couple of young people that go to that school. You need community representation, and you do need like school representation. So like whenever they had a local school council meeting, because local school councils are already developed in the schools, they would be present in those LSC meetings, because even though there was a safety committee that was formed, the people that were making the decisions were the local school councils. But one of the first things that they had to do as part of the process is that they actually had to look at the school discipline data. And that's important because a lot of people, like, I think Arlene, I heard you say this, like, you know, school shootings are actually like 1%, right, of what happens. But they stay with us because they're hella traumatic, right? So when you talk about school safety, a lot of people think like, oh my God, my school is gonna like have a shooting and all that. And so we need police officers, we need all this stuff. But they have to be rooted, like the conversation of safety has to be rooted in what's actually happening versus what is impacting you emotionally, right? So the first part of the process is that the schools have access to their disciplinary data so that they could actually see what is happening in their school, and that their conversations of what it means to be safe in their school is rooted in that information. So that was one of the first things that they have to do. It's to start the process in the first place.
Okay. Thank you, Maria. Any other questions? Nikki.
Well, thank you, Maria. I've enjoyed your perspective so far. You can always tell youth people because they're just like magnetic and you just love them. And that's what I got from you immediately. My daughter is 10, and my question is, and I understand you can only really speak to your experience, but for districts and areas that don't have quite as many, if any, resources, how can parents best advocate with the school board for better measures to make sure that kids are safe.
Yeah, I mean, I think so that's another component of our work, right? Like parent perspective is super important. And what we've done actually is like, so the 5 community-based organizations that are leading the whole school safety initiative, 3 of them are youth like centered or youth led. So that's Communities United, MICVA, and Build. And then the other 2 are like more parent oriented. That's Kofi Power Pack. And then the other one is Arc of St. Sabina. So it's really important that we have that balance, that while young people are telling their experience in schools of like what currently is happening, that they're also backed by the parents. And I think that when it comes to like, if you're working in an area where there's not a lot of resources, I think it's really important that you talk to other parents, because you do have that resource, right? Like, so it's kind of like old school organizing, or it's still kind of the same, where, you know, when you during the time where you drop off your kids, you'll see a lot of other parents, right? And it's really about striking that conversation of like, hey, what's up? What's going on with your kids? You know, this is what my kids are going through, stuff like that, right? And kind of starting that conversation and starting to have that connection with other parents. Because I guarantee you, if a shit ton of parents show up to a board meeting, they will literally be glued to you, right? So it's really about building that power with the parents, right? And really thinking about how you feel, what would make your kids safe. And I think that, you know, it doesn't hurt for parents to talk to their young people to help inform what's happening. But I think as a parent, while there's no resources, we definitely have phones now, and parents love to talk to each other. I think it's just about asking the right questions, you know, like, how do you feel safe, and what can we do to make our schools better?
Thank you, Maria. Nikki, just a quick question. Does your daughter's school have a school resource officer?
Yes, they have school resource officers that are employed by the county. It's a county school system, and they are usually like retired people from either the county police or city police that just hang out at school all day. And they are kind of the kids love them. They're like, oh, there's Mr. So-and-so, and they give high fives, and they're really awesome. But I know that that's not always the best solution or the only solution. Especially in communities that might not have so much trust for the police.
Right. Thanks, Nikki. We just have a couple minutes, so Sarah, please. Oh, can't hear you. Sorry.
To the point that you made in the greater session, Arlene, about having trauma-informed care, I know that in the work when I was with Impact Colorado, we did sort of a tandem training, not by choice so much, with another group of people in a school system, where we were teaching the individuals about personal safety, but then they were also doing tactical training on, active school shooting. They had the tactical piece, but they didn't have the trauma-informed piece. So what was happening was, now these children were becoming traumatized, right? And it was really hard in our portion of it, when we were trying to teach the individual personal safety skills piece. Everybody was really riled up. It was really hard to focus, things like that. So I think that even if they have trauma-informed, or they have officers there or some kind of training, that community piece of parents coming together to say, what does this training look like, and having an educational piece on the trauma-informed care, because those kids, already scared of what could happen, were going through scenarios that they didn't fully understand, and were coming out traumatized at the end, rather than probably helped of what could happen.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I found some stats. I didn't share them, but it was 40 after these active shooter drills, 39% higher rates of depression, 42% higher rates of stress and anxiety, physiological health problems as well. On top of that, when you check their social feeds, you see more words like blood, pain, pills coming up in their social feeds within, I think it's 30 days of these active shooter training drills. So They definitely need to be reevaluated.
Can I just say that, like, honestly, there's so many solutions to issues that we face, but it's really about going back to basics. When they put that together, that little training or whatever, if they had just run it by parents, like a few parents and some young folks, they would have heard the issues that may have came up. And so whatever we're doing in our spaces, if we involve the people that are directly impacted and allow them to share their wisdom and for us to listen and help inform the way that we approach things, we will be in a much better spot had we just stopped and realized that we don't, as individuals, don't have the answers. But if we work as a community, we could actually go further, right? I don't know if I could leave you with an African proverb that I heard in organizing, and that's, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together, right? And I think that that's the whole essence of this, right? If we can just approach things as a community where we could own it and lead it with our wisdom of our experience, then we would be in a much better space and a lot safer.
Great, great. Thank you, Maria. How are we doing on time, Nikki? Yeah, I like those applause and those head nodding and clicking. Yes. Great.
We've pushed it pretty far. If we want to have time to recap, we need to adjourn.
Okay, let's head back. Thank you. Hope you had some spirited conversation in that breakout room.
Yes, ma'am.
We continue to be inspired by Maria in our room. So, Jen, do you want to share a little bit of
Sure.
happened in your room?
Yeah, well, Maria impacted our room, even though she wasn't there. A lot of what we discussed fell to ownership and the partnership with the school. And that partnership is between school administration and the parents, right? Because parents are always looking to the school to have more accountability and more like cognizant behavior around safety and security. But there's also that part where the parents in their intelligence gathering and communication is working with the school. So it's kind of like, if I can, a top-down, bottom-up approach for a holistic plan for the school. So that was pretty great in learning that. Also, Krista Hanley brought up, resources for schools, and Steve went into more in depth about what is happening right now is more check the box with their lockdown drills and all that other stuff. And it's up to the schools to actually invest in safety and security. And what that would look like is actually engaging outside, consultants that would come in and actually work with the school and the students in training them. That's the most effective way. I know, right? I don't know. What do we do? What do we do?
All right. Okay.
But yeah, those are kind of some of the biggest takeaways. And then also, one of the questions that came up was, how do you identify safe places for youth victims of trafficking? And Lamont, poignantly said that, youth that has been trafficked or is in the process of being trafficking can identify a survivor of trafficking. And if those people are put in places of mentorship, you create a safe space and create a safe environment with those people in leadership, because they can identify, oh, this person doesn't understand what the heck I'm going through, but this person, they know. So those were kind of the three big.
Great.
Monkeys.
Thank you, Jen.
Yes.
In our breakout room, the first question that came up is, how did the task force even get people to have a conversation about not having school resource officers at school? How did they even start that conversation? Maria just shared that there was really kind of a strong arm approach, like, hey, you have to come and have a conversation with us, or the funding might not be there, or you're gonna, it was kind of a strong arm approach. Come to this, you've got to have input, you've got to have say, you've got to hear us out. And then it opened up to some incredible conversations, in some schools keeping their resource officer, some not. But it is the goal of the task force to move to where schools do not have officers, armed officers in their schools. There was also an idea that an approach, there were all kind of alternatives to the school resource officers. There was a restorative justice professional, there was a risk counselor, there were conflict resolution folks, there was a meditation room or a peace room. So they had all these other options that they could bring into their school. So they gave them a really strong menu, which then led to a little more confidence of being able to say no to a school resource officer. Also, there was a question on how do we advise parents to keep their schools safe, if there's any advice for parents on what they can do in their communities to keep their schools safe. And Maria just said, old school organizing. When you're in the line dropping your kids off, start having conversations with other parents, talk to other parents. Hey, do you feel safe? Does your kid feel safe? Are you hearing anything? What would you do different? So really just old school organizing is a good start. And then there was a question about, how some of this training we touched upon it in the main meeting, in the main room a little bit, but how it can trigger young people and really set off a couple different dominoes that aren't positive: depression and anxiety through these active shooter trainings. And so there was an acknowledgement that, these trainings have to be trauma informed no matter what they are coming into the schools. And Maria made a wonderful point that, those programs that are really harsh that are coming into the schools, if they would have just asked 2 parents and 2 students what they thought before the programming went in, they may have heard, hey, this is a little too harsh, this is a little stressful. So once again, always going back to inclusionary conversations around safety in the schools. Wow, I'm super psyched. This was a fantastic panel. I know we're a few minutes over, but I would like Maria and Lamont and Steve, if there's anything you'd like to share before we close up. Maria?
No, I mean, I think I just really appreciate the space where opinions and wisdom is really taken seriously. And I appreciate being in a space with Stephen and Lamont, who tackle safety in a very different form, but do appreciate that we have a lot of commonality goal of making sure that everybody is safe and that we're moving forward. So I really appreciate being in the space. So thank you so much, Arlene.
Thank you,
Great.
Marie.
Steve?
Well, I'll end with this. School resource officers, Band-Aid. Lockdown drills, a Band-Aid. School safety and security needs reconstructive surgery. And that's what I think PAVE and other elements are bringing to the table. It just needs to be rethought. So thank you for the opportunity, Arlene, Mandy, all of you, and pleasure to meet you, Maria and Lamont.
You too.
Lamont?
Yeah, and just on my side here, we are expanding into other cities. We're looking at a number of cities. I'll keep the folks at PAVE abreast, so that just in case there's some collaborative work that we can do, I would love that. We are a small team and always wearing way too many hats, as I'm sure you are too. But yeah, we have resources as professional development and our lights curriculum, and we can come into a community and help identify the gaps so that we can better prevent and better respond to trafficking in a community. So if you know any folks that need any of that, you can hit me up. I'll put my email in the chat.
Great. Thank you, Lamont. Thank you for all 3 of you for just so quickly just saying yes to this panel and being a part of it. I appreciate your support and your passion for creating a safer world, because that's what you're doing. I hope you know that and you acknowledge that in the work that you're doing. There is a small short survey that anyone who participated today, we would love you to fill out. It's in the chat. It gives us a lot of valuable information, so we'd appreciate that. And then please join us Thursday. The party continues. Thursday, our topic is safety and healing for women and girls, how to create a culture of change. Oh, that's not it, is it? Okay. Yeah, well, it's a Title IX. We're going to be discussing a lot about Title IX and creating community and safer spaces. We have a wonderful guest, Diane Rosenfeld, who's the author of a best-selling novel that's out right now, a book that's out right now, The Bonobo Sisterhood. It is fantastic and just insightful and thought-provoking. So we hope to have you join us on Thursday. Thank you again for the support.